back at Ground Zero Salem with Pat once again. Got an LP update for you. A bunch of stuff that's been stacking up in the old box right there. That's my Now Playing box, if you didn't know, my little crate. Passed on to me by my dad, actually, when he gave me a bunch of records. There's my Bat Guy. This is not an easy gag or really a funny one. Look, I'm pointing at stuff in the background. Got a bunch of LPs that I've been kind of collecting piling up since September or so. A lot of noisy, kind of D-beat-driven punk of various stripes and subgenres from a couple of different countries, namely Sweden and Japan, as well as some other types of hardcore, kind of more America-leaning hardcore. Got some death rock, post-punk, dark wave-ish kind of stuff as well, and a few other odds and bobs. So, let's get into it. Yeah, this is like a long period of not listening to a ton of metal. Still enough, still plenty of metal, but really digging into a lot of this kind of Discharge-inspired, Discharge-driven, rhythmically influenced kind of hardcore stuff with a bunch of different stripes. A lot of Swedish kind of like Kang Punk, I believe it's called. A lot of the noisier, kind of metallic, crusty brand of hardcore. There's something about this stuff that takes direct influence from Discharge and the Verukers and bands like that, where it's fast, but it's not hyper fast. There are lyrics, but they have this sort of like almost kind of haiku element to them, where it's strong riff, strong, simple riff, vocals. Strong riff, strong, simple riff, vocals. It's got a certain like steadfast kind of power to it in its repetition. Whereas like I really liked that, but it was always secondary to me to a lot of stuff like New York hardcore. Bands like the Cro-Mags, who pioneered the New York hardcore sound, did borrow a lot from Discharge too, rhythmically as well as Motorhead. But I feel like Bad Brains, MDC, all the classic American hardcore stuff is very verbose. Like all those bands had a lot to say and cram a lot more lyrics in, whereas people taking directly just from the Discharge school, obviously the early Swedish bands took that and made it a lot more brutal. Bands like Anti-Cimex, who are a big influence on a bunch of the bands that I'm talking about. There's a lot of like just that kind of fast talking, that auctioneer style stuff that Kurt Brecht from DRI did, or HR from the Bad Brains. I think listening to stuff like, well, what I'll be getting into specifically, Skit System and Wolfpack and a bunch of other bands, it's a little bit more, I don't know, it's a little bit more sparse, a little bit more desperate by the fact that there's not as much like steadfast, fast-talking auctioneer kind of singing over it. And I think that's why that it's been more appealing to me, because it's just something that I haven't listened to into the ground. You know, always have love for my U.S. hardcore stuff, and there's a bunch of bands in this update that fall within those parameters that I like a lot. A few that actually really qualify as albums of the year and stuff like that. But we'll get into that as I progress through my pile of records here. Don't want to get too ahead of myself. So first off, let's talk about Skit System. I got these two records on the Havoc website, or maybe it was Felix's Discogs. I don't know. Same thing, coming from the same house, the same heavily armored house. Both very cheap. They were like $9 to $11. This is their, I think, a 10-inch and a 12-inch on one LP, I think, is what the deal is. Gravarld and Svarta Tankar. And then you have the last record they did, Stigmata, from 2006. This is late 90s, 98, 99, I think, something like that. Skit System were a band that took a lot of influence from Anti-Cimex and the classic Swedish hardcore bands, D-beat and Discharge-inspired bands that brought a more brutal, heavy edge to things. Crude SS, Asocial, a bunch of bands that just very early for their time were quoted as like influences on grindcore and everything, because they would take that kind of beat and bring a certain brutality to it. There was a lot of noise and distortion with all these bands. Agony with an I at the end before they changed it to a Y and became thrash metal. Stuff like that, just crushing shit. Into the 90s you had bands like Skit System, Driller Killer, Wolfpack, who had the vocalist from Anti-Cimex very early on, kind of developing things a little bit more, tightening things up. Not really losing anything in the ferocity, but maybe gaining quite a bit in terms of musicianship and chops, playing ability. But still somehow capturing that chaos of the early feral kind of Swedish hardcore stuff. A lot of it was on that Stockholm's Mongol compilation that I showed off a little while ago. I hear Mongol as a term, I hear Kang Punk. I'm honestly just learning of what these genres are and what they mean. I've heard them mentioned in passing for years, you know, just being a casual observer, being involved in punk and hardcore. I don't know what the difference between the two is, to be completely honest. Same kind of deal with Blazing Spirits, Japanese hardcore. I know that I believe Bastard and Deathside are part of that. I know it involves kind of like a lot of metallic leads. But then there's Crasher Crust, you know, which I believe is the noisier disclose. There's all these little tiny subgenres, which is something that metal's really known for. Hardcore less so, but because everybody just wants to be like, hey, we're just a hardcore band. But these divisions do exist in sound, and it's interesting, at least to me, if you want to get nerdy. But Skit System, this earlier recordings record, this is brutal, it's heavy. You can hear the influence of Swedish death metal coming back around and influencing the hardcore, and that's fairly apparent in tone, just the weight of the music. Tampa Lundberg, also of At the Gates, is the vocalist on this, so there's that kind of crossover right there. And it's quite good, you know, recommended to people who like any kind of crust, really, anything with that discharge beat. I find that there's the kind of the thrashy D beat, that kind of beat. Forgive me for onomatopoeing the drum beats, but we got to do it. And then there's also like another type of beat that's prevalent in a lot of their songs. It's a little bit more mid-paced, like rock and roll, kind of like there's a lot of that. So, and a lot of iterations of both kind of thrown together. It's heavy, it's pummeling. There's something weird about the riffs that are very, almost kind of desperate. The way, the cohesiveness of the notes and everything always kind of feels like it's falling off of a cliff. There's just something really bleak about their choice of the way they line up all the riffs and the notes and all that. Then a couple of albums later, you've got Stigmata, which Lundberg is not on. Lundberg, Tampa isn't on. A little bit more metal on this. They were kind of metalish, metallic anyway, but this has a certain kind of black metal leaning, which is apropos enough because it's got the guitarist from Martyrdod playing leads and second guitar on it. A lot of lyrics involving like mental health and self-harm and stuff. Very, very fucking dark stuff. Both of these reissues came out on Havoc, as I mentioned, and they're on nice kind of reverse board jackets. Very, very cool. Then, I talked about Wolfpack recently. I've been, and Wolf Brigade, same band. I've been on a big deep dive with this stuff. First off, I repurchased, or purchased on a different format, The Enemy Reality, which was one of my favorite records of last year that came out. I showed off the CD for my AOTY stuff. Might have been number one with me, I don't even remember, but it was definitely up there. Fucking great record. They came back with a vengeance. They were out of commission for 4 or so years in the mid-2000s. Their singer got, Mickey got like a tumor in his throat. I believe it was benign. He had to have it removed so he couldn't sing for a while. And it seems like since the last couple of records, they've really been gaining steam. This is a wonderful fusion of traditional Swedish hardcore and a whole bunch of other influences, including black metal and new wave of British heavy metal and good old-fashioned punk rock. And they meld them all perfectly. Going right back to their second record, though, when they were still called Wolfpack, that was Wolf Brigade, The Enemy Reality. This is Wolfpack Lycanthropunk. Also on Southern Lord. Reissued. I think it was on Distortion or something like that originally. And this, they were still kind of like following the traditions of Swedish hardcore, all their forebears like Anti-Cimex and bands of that ilk, but already involving like a strong Motorhead influence. There's some great double bass on this, but it's that Overkill, the song style double bass, like that real primal early double bass style that Phil the Animal Taylor pioneered on it. It's just a nasty, snaggle-toothed, bad-breathed fucking punk record with just enough heaviness to appeal to metalheads. All this led all these bands were kind of precursors to all the stadium crust, quote unquote, that pejorative term, bands that came along in the early to mid 2000s in America, like Tragedy and From Ashes Rise, who kind of took the certain melodic elements that Wolfpack would occasionally have. You know, you'd have like these kind of octave chordy, like melodic parts here and there, just tastefully thrown in there. Like it starts when you just feel like it's like, wow, that's getting a little NoFXy. They pull out of it and turn back into like, you know, a Motorhead Venom Discharge kind of thing. Tragedy kind of took those little elements and weaved them in with some other influences, like from Japanese hardcore, Blazing Spirit stuff, and really kind of made their own really catchy sound. Tragedy were an incredible band in their heyday and are still going. And you know, if you like stuff from this wing of punk, this sort of dischargey kind of thing, and you haven't checked out Tragedy for whatever reason, for some people actually it might be a little on the slick side if you like stuff really noisy, but they were a great band. They were super important when I was really involved in hardcore and going to shows a lot. And finally you've got a D-Beat Odyssey, which is the last thing Wolf Brigade did before their kind of brief hiatus. This was intended to be a 7-inch. They expanded it into a 12-inch EP. It's 6 songs. 2 of the songs feature Puffin, I believe that's his name, from Totalitar, doing backing vocals, which is, I guess it was pretty noteworthy at the time because he'd never sang on anything else before. But this is right when Mickey, the singer, found out that he was, you know, he had this issue with his throat that he had to get removed. So it was kind of under the wire there, and you can really hear the desperation and like the anger and just the immediacy in it. Their music doesn't really veer off too far from what they've been doing up until this point. They had a couple of records as Wolf Brigade past this, or before this, and I don't remember even what they're called. Progression Regression, I think, is one of them. And those are pretty slick for the time, at least for like a crust punk record. This is a little bit more on the raw side, like I said, more immediate and angry and to the point. You know, it's a good like 6-song EP. Cool artwork too, and I believe the artist is a pretty heralded artist for like a lot of punk stuff in Sweden, but I'm not familiar with his work really. Then we've got Totalitar, Sin Egen Mozendata. Speaking of Totalitar, so this was just reissued on Prank Records. Came out in 1994, I think. Let's see. Yes. Some of the music goes back to 85, though. Totalitar, a band that bridges the gap between a lot of generations of Swedish hardcore. They're still at it. They're still going. They put out a record in 2007. I think that was the last one they put out. It was very good. You know, one of those bands that shows up every decade or two and just kicks ass. Yeah, it has that Swedish tradition of really pummeling hardcore, a lot of like that discharge beat going, but plenty of other influences, you know, a lot of hard rockin' stuff that reminds me a little bit of Nine Shock's Terror. Although I guess Nine Shock's Terror probably reminds me of Totalitar because Totalitar was around first. A lot of snot, a lot of vigor, plenty of pounding fast stuff, but plenty of mid-pace, like Fist in the Air, pogo punk vibes as well. Stuff that'll get stuck in your head even if you don't speak Swedish, for sure. Also from that Havoc order, I picked up this Sacrilege Demos collection. It's Time to Face the Reaper. Demos 84 to 86. I've talked about Sacrilege plenty, but if you don't know, they were a British hardcore band at first that transitioned into a really unique kind of thrash metal band. Super piercing, shrieking, banshee kind of vocals, courtesy of Tam. This is a real comprehensive demos collection. I've had several of these that only have 1 or 2. I got another one that has like a couple of the demos and then a really poorly recorded set from a squad on the other side. This actually has, I believe, everything they did as far as demos that spans the gamut from their early discharge worshipping kind of stuff well into the era of their albums with songs like Flight of the Nazgul and stuff that was a lot more like epic thrash, you know, with a lot of punk grit to it. all in all, a great classic band, and as I get older and the more I listen to them, the more they become one of my favorites. Then we got a newer one here, although from what I've read, this has a lot of all-stars, including members of Dysphere in it. Another Swedish Mongol band, Svaveldioxid. This came out in 2019, so it's pretty new. It sounds like there's a remixed version of it floating around on cassette. The title of it is Dod Sagan Blick. I am really bad at pronouncing Scandinavian languages, if you couldn't tell. This is crushing. Absolutely crushing, not reinventing the wheel. Plenty noisy for people that like, you know, a little bit of like distortion or feedback and that kind of stuff, but also plenty palatable. You can discern riffs and everything. Fast, you know, discharge fast type of stuff. Not, doesn't require a doctorate to really describe it or anything, but it's just perfect, crusty Swedish hardcore. Awesome, awesome shit. Really well recorded, great bass sound. Got a real kind of clangy kind of bass sound that you can separate by your ear from the guitar in the music. Then we've got a reissue. This is Japanese stuff I'm jumping into here now. 1990, Nightmare, Give Notice of Nightmare. Came out on Farewell and La Familia. Another band that just seems to pop up every decade and a half. They have a split with Concrete Socks from around this time, late 80s, early 90s. And then a split with Skit Kids, like, in the mid-2000s. So they have been around for a hot minute, seem to drop an LP every 10 to 15 years. And if this LP is anything to go by, we're always fucking rad. I do have the split with Skit Kids, too. It's also really great. Fast Japanese hardcore. Super, like, gritty, abrasive guitar tone. And they have those riffs, like, a lot of it's just, like, nonstop fast. You know, if you've heard Bastard, if you've heard Deathside, like, it's along those lines. Maybe not as much in the Blazing Solos department, but that's somewhat represented as well. And then there's, like, one or two, like, shit kicker songs that have, like a riff that almost could be, like, I don't even know, like a Wasp riff, but through this kind of, like, you know, Japanese hardcore filter. Yeah, you have to just stream this and find out what I mean by that. If I can find an MP3 of it, I'll throw it in as a clip here if I'm not feeling too lazy. But yeah, there's just like one or two like real fucking rocked out songs that just make you want to fucking headbang, and it's awesome. Nightmare, fucking great. Then a reissue of the Misery SDS split. This has been out of print for some time. Profane Existence repressed it. Misery, I mean, I could be wrong. I'm no total historian on this, but I think we're probably the first proper crust band in the United States. I think they go back to 87 or 88. Carrying on that tradition of stenchcore and crust and all that stuff from the UK. From bands like Hellcrusher, Deviated Instinct, all that stuff. Carrying on that kind of gloomy, crushing kind of sound, like not totally tight, but very, very impactful, steamrolling kind of riffs, punk fast, but then also like throbbingly heavy, very apparent Amoebics influence with all that stuff. Misery, as far as I know, were one of the first, at least, bands to do that in the United States, along with Nausea from New York. And this is a great example of their sound. The 5 songs on this. What I like about Misery is they do have those heavy, crushing, like borderline almost grind or death metal, at least in tone, kind of songs. You know, proper crust. But then they have songs that almost have like a blitz or like street punk kind of catchiness as well. Like they have a few. They know how to write a good snotty punk tune, but it's through a complete layer of gloom and just a web of fucking darkness. It's awesome. Then you got SDS, Japanese crust band, fucking really good. Like so close to almost being crossover or something. Like there's so many trappings of like speed and thrash metal in it. It's crusty, it's fast, it's got growly vocals, like relatively simple, at least compared to a lot of like metal riffs and guitar parts, but there's just those quick little kind of thrash parts in it that just make it. It's super tight. Almost sounds like a more tightened up version of their country mates Asbestos, if you've ever heard them. Like a heavier, tighter, more well-produced Asbestos. Love me some Asbestos, don't get me wrong. But yeah, SDS is awesome. After I heard this, I was like, fuck, I need more by this band, and all that I can find on Discogs are some collections that are like a lot of money. So I probably won't pull the trigger on any SDS for a while. Alright, let's put away the butt flap and dread mullet stuff for a minute here and get into, you know, crew cuts and Fred Perry's and shit. Heavy Discipline. Pittsburgh hardcore. Heavily influenced by Boston stuff, particularly SSD, Negative Effects, Exclaim Records, all over this. One of the best bands to do it this side of Boston Strangler, in my opinion. And I'm opinionated about that sort of thing. I mean, I live here in the Boston area. I grew up listening to this kind of hardcore. Heavy Discipline do it really, really well. It's a lot of Pittsburgh dudes involved. I know some people from Blood Pressure, probably No Time, that whole scene. Just very, very well executed Boston-style hardcore. They get the tone right, that kind of like, whatever, that L bar, like, it's heavy and thick and sounds layered, but it's also weirdly wiry and trebly. It's like 10 trebly guitars all playing at once kind of tone. Just the build-up, those kind of rolling, like, slower riffs into really fast, punishing, rapid-fire barking kind of hardcore vocals. Just great shit. This came out on Painkiller, who can do no wrong pretty much ever. Great label that consistently puts out wonderful hardcore music. That's great. In a similar vein, we have the Rated X LP. I really liked the demo when it dropped. This is a British straight edge band. New wave of British hardcore. Members of Violent Reaction. Yeah, this carries along the same lines as the demo. Like extreme hardcore in like a mid-80s sense. You know, you could say it's not too far from, I don't know, like maybe Straight Ahead or something like that. If you like the Confront 7-inch, there's a very like pretty stark disparity between fast and like slow breakdowns, but it's not the, of course, the, you know, chugga metal breakdowns. It's like a creepy crawl mosh kind of breakdown. Yeah, real like hard hitting, very fucking heavy in its own way. Great kind of rough vocals as you can expect. Just awesome kind of hardcore. And this like hardcore is kind of hard to nail. There's not too many bands that do it really well or really do it at all. You have No Tolerance from Boston who do it really well. Confront, of course. Maybe Proclamation, although they were a little bit more metal. You know, it's one step away from being like Power Violence or Infest or DRI, but it's just human enough sounding and not ridiculous, as ridiculously like fast, slow, blast beat, you know, as that stuff. Still like straight up like hardcore punk. Really good stuff when people can pull it off, and Rated X pulls it off really well. United Front also came out on Painkiller. I imagine in the UK it probably came out on Quality Control HQ, which is a great label as well. Work in tandem with Painkiller. Then we've got Change, Closer Still. Sorry about the glare. I left the shrink on this because I wanted to keep the sticker. I'm gonna take it off eventually. But this is a straight edge band from Seattle, I believe. Features a Ram who is in a lot of bands. I believe he was in. It has members of anyway. The First Step, Champion, I think React. That whole scene, that kind of like post Youth Crew kind of bunch of dudes. And this is the best band. I mean, I really like The First Step. I'm, you know, choosy about this kind of stuff. I am a huge fan of the original bands, most of them, especially Uniform Choice. Love Uniform Choice. And you can see the homage there. It's like the same font as Uniform Choice. And the cover art, again, with the tree is very, like, 89, 90, you know, posi-core, but, like, kind of going a little bit beyond having, like, the collegiate letters and a crowd mosh photo, you know, like, introspective kind of stuff. The music is killer. I mean, the dude's a master of going in between, like, very impassioned, somewhat hoarse yell into like melodic singing. There's perfect gang vocals on this, as you would expect. A little bit more like kind of mature guitar approaches. They go into like a reggae part after one of the songs on here. I think it's Beyond. I believe it's the song Beyond, if I'm not mistaken. It goes into almost what feels like a pseudo reggae, early Fugazi, like Revolution Summer kind of thing on one of the songs. But yeah, they're melodic when they need to be. Everything's super catchy. It's wicked finger pointy in a good way. Really, really good record. Came out on React. Yeah, I mean, one of these bands come along like once a decade that I really enjoy. Turning Point, also. As far as like old school influences, Turning Point, stuff like that, big on this. Free Will, you know. But anyway, as far as new stuff, the last band that I gave a shit about that sounded like this was The First Step. And, you know, it takes a lot to catch my ear. And this record is a fantastic example of that kind of positive, straight-edge hardcore stuff. Then you've got Age of Apocalypse with The Way. And this is a compilation of an EP and a demo, I believe, on Fuzz Records. This band's from the Hudson Valley. This came out last year, I think. This is like straight off the East Coast Assault comp. It's a weird combination of kind of melodic vocal, like metallic hardcore, very specifically from like 1990, 1991. You have sort of almost like a hybrid of Mina Caputo and Messiah Marcolin. That's the cool thing about it. It's moshy and heavy. It's also kind of fucking like epic doom at the same time. It's got a very pronounced like sort of Solitude Aeternus or Candlemass thing, but also like a you're wearing your Carhartt hoodie in the pit kind of vibe. It's fucking really, really good. If you like Twitching Tongues, doesn't sound like Twitching Tongues, but you can tell it's like the same range of influences. A lot of the Brooklyn hardcore from the early 90s, metallic hardcore, that kind of stuff. Crossover even, you could call that stuff in sort of a way. And fucking like epic doom metal. It's rad. It's really good. Let's see if this came on a cool color. I don't remember. Oh, yes, it did. How about that? Yeah, that's cool. Not bad. Then we've got Bob Villain with We Live Here. So this is a 8-song, full length. This is UK hip-hop with a very strong punk underpinning to it. And I've heard a lot of, you know, a lot of bands lately, a lot of hip-hop groups lately involving rock and metal in creative different ways that wasn't really attempted before, you know, back in the 90s when I was only 47 years old, like with the Judgment Night soundtrack and that kind of stuff. Bands like Horror and Ghostmain and all that kind of stuff. And I've heard that stuff. Like, those bands are completely different, of course, those two artists. But nothing really has caught my ear that much, but I really like this Bob Villain LP. British hip-hop guy. Straight up, I don't know a lot about the whole UK hip-hop scene, what qualifies as grime or whatever, but I like the guy's vocal cadence. I love his style. Really fucking pissed, socially conscious lyrics, speaking to the black experience of growing up over there. A lot of heavy shit to say, a lot of important shit to say, and really cool, like punk as fuck guitar work that's real raw. It's awesome, you know, carrying on the tradition of hip hop and punk rock from the UK. So that's rad. Then a record that I've been putting off buying for like several years now, which makes me feel like an asshole, as I'm friends with one of the members of this band, and I knew this record was good. I just didn't get around to it for quite a while, and I'm kicking myself. This is Exit Order with Seed of Hysteria. This came out on Side 2 Records, the drummer's imprint. Yeah, like fairly unique and singular sounding hardcore punk stuff. You know, kind of bouncy, pissed off, fast enough but not unintelligible. It's certainly got like kind of like a strong anarcho-punk and post-punk sort of approach. The production is as such that everything's really well showcased, particularly the bass. It's very kind of bass and drums driven, but it's got some great slashing guitars, fucking furious vocals, really, really good stuff. I can see why it made a lot of lists and people were talking about it a lot like 3 years ago. I think at the time I was so knee-deep in all that OSDM type of shit that I kind of, you know, gave it a pass for whatever stupid reason. I think also it's because I was like, oh, I can always order one from, 12 miles away at any time, but I would have probably enjoyed it a lot more. There's a fly down here, and it's going to drive me crazy. It's going to Mike Pence me, and I'm going to be so fucking bummed. Then we got Omega Tribe, No Love Lost. I don't know why that's not quite... There's a lot of white on that. Speaking of anarcho-punk, this is one of those classic anarcho-punk bands that comes from, like, maybe the cooler side of the pillow, so to speak. Not as furious and angry and dark as, like, Conflict or Flux of Pink Indians or Icons of Filth. Not as diatribe-laden. More like, looking deeper into a lot of the same subjects that they would explore about class consciousness and stuff like that. Kind of more along the lines of a Mob or Zounds or that kind of thing. Not as mopey and kind of post-punky as the Mob, and not as, like, Gang of Four worshipping, I guess, as Zounds, but kind of along the lines of something a little bit more musical. Really, really well put together music. Super catchy, melodic anarcho-punk, we'll say. Fucking great band. Then we got 45 Grave. Sleep in Safety. Debut LP. I think it's their first LP. The other one that I have, if I'm not mistaken, is a collection of singles and everything. I prefer that early raw punk stuff more, but this is still a great one. I mean, it's got Party Time on it, Most fist-pumping anthem with the most fucking uncomfortable fucking lyrics ever. But 45 Grave. If you're friends with me, which you all are, you know and love 45 Grave. Originators of, like, LA death rock, preceding a lot of stuff that came after, like TSOL and Christian Death, existing at the same time, but I think 45 Grave were the first, if I'm not mistaken. Don't trust me on that. I'm going to fact check myself, but pretty sure. Fun influences from garage, the classic punk wave, and you got, like, some harpsichordy keyboards and stuff like that on there. That song Surf Bat is amazing. It's almost like the Munsters theme, but, like, even cooler, even more punk. Violent World. It still has that kind of angry LA hardcore tinge to it, but it's spooky, Fucking great shit, man. This is a Yugoslavian band. I have no idea how that's pronounced, but we'll just call them GRC. We'll pretend it's an acronym, because I'm a Yank. Sloboda Narudo. Yeah, this was reissued by FOAD some years ago. Let's forget the FOAD, despite being known for releasing all this metal stuff, does a lot of great punk reissues. A lot of good Japanese stuff. This is a pretty obscure, kind of post-punk, almost reaching towards like an anarcho kind of sound band from Yugoslavia during the 80s. Not sure what part of Yugoslavia or what country it became. The country doesn't exist anymore. But it definitely has a very, like, in a vacuum, we're talking, like, in a very different time and place, kind of created sort of, like, desperate, I want to say industrial, but I don't mean industrial in the sense of tape loops or bleeps and bloops or synthesizers. I mean industrial in the sense that it feels like abandoned concrete buildings and people, like, hitting stuff with hammers, We're talking fairly conventional instrumentation here, but it definitely has a super heavy kind of Killing Joke vibe, and I'm always a sucker for that. Also, speaking of Eric, he talked about this recently. Got the Mission Children. I don't have too much to add on top of what Eric said. This is a great record. If you didn't know, the Mission, I think they're still called the Mission UK on this, were members of Sisters of Mercy from the First, Last, and Always lineup that, parted ways, not amicably, I don't think, from Andrew Eldritch, and kind of started their own band. The guitar style, the signature guitar style it's unmistakable, because it's these weird kind of riffs that circle around, and, like, they're almost like jigs, but they're dark, and it's like you could play that on fucking lute, man. Really good stuff. Like, you could tell they were going for something a little bit more commercial, or it seems like that. Maybe it's just happenstance, but the vocals are a lot less, croony and dark than Eldritch's vocals. In a lot of ways, it seems like it could be on the same tier as, like, very early U2 or New Model Army or something like that. It's a lot more radio friendly, it seems like, than the Sisters of Mercy. But regardless, great record. I have their debut as well upstairs on tape, and I like that a lot too. I've been hearing about the Mission since the 90s when I think Henry Rollins slagged them. And I love Henry, but man, I took everything that guy said at face value because I was an impressionable, teenager that liked to hear an angry guy yell about stuff he didn't like. I mean, the guy's come a long way, obviously. But man, I didn't give U2 a shot. I didn't give The Cure a shot. I didn't give the Smiths a shot. I didn't give the Mission a shot because Henry Rollins really hated those bands and talked shit about them on a bunch of his early stuff. He probably cringes at it now, I'm sure. Anyways, moving on to somewhat related stuff. I got 2 albums by Silence from Pittsburgh here. This is a Profane Existence band. More dark punk stuff. Dark, political, kind of post-punkish kind of shit. One thing that I will say about this is that a lot of post-punk, goth, whatever, death rock kind of shit is very bass-driven. I noticed that there's a lot of bass and drums being in lockstep with each other, and the guitar going off and kind of creating these different types of textures. Seems pretty common with bands like Southern Death Cult and the like. Silence does do that, but they do have a lot of more punk rock riffs going on, everything serving the main riff as being the central point of the song, I guess. And what that brings to mind is a few bands from the Pacific Northwest during the last decade, The Estranged and The Observers, the Red Dons, who seem to kind of take influence from Joy Division and stuff like that, but also from the Wipers and some Pacific Northwest garage rockish kind of shit, maybe even involving sort of a Murder City Devils kind of vibe. So it was mixing several flavors of sad bastardness. Silence seems to do a slightly more modernized version of that, kind of. This one is definitely the first one, The Deafening Sound of Absolutely Nothing, which came out in 2016 on Profane Existence. This is a little bit more of a straightforward, we're a bunch of punks that like post-punk and death rock, and we're going to do our own take on it, have, political lyrics, but involve a strong influence of, I feel a fair amount of, maybe LA stuff, Christian Death, and, TSOL's gothier material, maybe, and some other stuff going on. UK stuff too, sure, no doubt. But this one, the guy's vocals improve a lot on this one as well. His vocal chops really improve a lot on this. 2 years later, Countdown's Begun, where this song on here, Agony, which is a catchy song. I don't get many new songs stuck in my head for days. Definitely have Agony stuck in my head right now because I'm thinking about it. Agony almost has a refrain that sounds like something from Nevermind the Bollocks, and it really works. There's a lot more traditional punk kind of seeping into this one. Touches of even melodic hardcore and punk from the 80s from the United States. I feel even a little bit of Husker Du or something. Might be off base with that, but that's kind of what's coming to mind right now. At any rate, both these are super fun, listenable, catchy records. Dark, political, but toe-tapping as hell. Then you got Kulturkampf, Caught in an Evil Web of Violence. This was a frustrating one to get because I used to own this and decided I didn't need it and flipped it, which is always stupid. This is a UK band, pretty much coming from the anarcho side of things. It's 2 demos on 1 LP, Corpse of Bureaucracy and The Struggle. This band kind of had a lot of similar darkness to The Mob and Rudimentary Peni. But again, there's something kind of bright in some of the melodies on this that aren't quite the same as bands like that. Again, sort of reminding me of a little bit of melodic American stuff. I'm not saying Silly Girl by the Descendants or something like that, but I can't quite put my finger on it. There's something that's just not quite as dreary with Kulturkampf, but pretty dreary nonetheless. But great bunch of songs on here. This was only 5 or 6 euros, something like that. It's not a super popular, sought-after record, but it wasn't available anywhere in the United States, so I paid out the ass for shipping just to get it in my hands again, because I have been craving this stuff like crazy, and it's great. It's super good. Now, then we've got a couple of records from the same artist under different names, a couple of different projects. So for years I've been hearing tons of stuff about Drab Majesty. Popular with metal kids for whatever reason. I remember Sean Blaggerith mentioning this, a couple other people, even Josh Armijo I think maybe talked about this. It's dark wave synthy stuff. Circa 2015 is when this came out. So it's a modern take. It's very lush and layered, but feels very like analog and like old school programmed synths at the same time. The Deb Demure is the alter ego of the main person that does the writing for all this. And there's 3 albums deep. This is the first one. This is the only one I've owned so far. It's great. It takes a lot of... Careless is the name of it. It takes a lot from the heavy hitters from the 80s. You know, there's certainly Joy Division, New Order, Depeche Mode, all that kind of stuff. Orchestral maneuvers in the dark, whatever. It's got that sort of gloomy synthy thing, but you could feel like there's other influences at play. You know, like there's some modern pop kind of stuff going into it, and a lot of different approaches to songs, a lot of different tempos, and it's got a very like, you know, morose kind of dancey vibe to it, but it's also firmly like in a synth pop kind of realm. It doesn't get like too crushing or anything like that. Deb Demure, under a different pseudonym, has another project with a member of Antioch Arrow and Heroin, the early screamo bands from San Diego, which when I was reading a bit about this, I thought that was really interesting because I know that a bunch of those bands from that Gravity scene took a lot of inspiration from death rock and goth, but just completely translated it into a different genre, you know, did something original with it. Angel Hair, I think, was a big one for being influenced by it. I don't know if they shared members with the aforementioned. I don't think they did. But this is similar in some ways to Drab Majesty. It's very synth-driven, gloomy kind of stuff, but this has a harsher industrial backbeat to it. You know, maybe very early Ministry, very early Skinny Puppy. Not really sounding like them at all, but, you know, a band that could be on a mixtape or a comp with it, you know. Yeah, really kind of entrancing. Just the drum machine stuff on it is a lot more like punishing than the Drab Majesty stuff. You're gonna dance harder to this in the club. You know, you're gonna do the swatting at flies dance if you've ever been at an industrial or goth club. Heavier and faster to that. And finally, Clan of Zymox. Kind of synthy, goth sort of stuff from the Netherlands. Second LP, second full length from 1986, came out on 4AD. Fits in pretty well on 4AD, I'd say. Not as ethereal sounding as some of the other bands, but you can kind of catch a little bit like a little bit of like maybe a neo-classically inspired thing in just the way some of the synths are arranged. But it's very much like a gloomy, almost synth pop affair. Lots of strumming guitars, you know, how in the way that The Cure did that back in the day. Good crooning kind of vocals. I've been listening to this because I've been forcing myself to lately, just because I want to have something to say about these records when I'm showing them off, and I've really been enjoying it, actually. It's a good companion with the Drab Majesty and VR Sex stuff, because it feels like, you know, what maybe those artists drew a lot of inspiration from. Or maybe not, I don't know. But at any rate, that's good dark synthy goth stuff with strummed guitars. And that is my pile of stuff. Can't wait to file all these. That'll be good. So that's it for now. I hope everyone has a good rest of the week. If I'm feeling super froggy and have the energy, I'll probably shoot another update. Until then, thanks for tagging along on my midlife crisis. Have a good one.